Montana Territory, April 1878. The rain had turned the road to Greystone into a river of mud, and by the time she stumbled past the bent fence post at the edge of town, Kathryn Granger looked less like a bride and more like a ghost in a ruined dress. She collapsed face first in the muck just past the general store, her white skirts soaked brown, veil torn halfway from her pinned-up hair. Her hands trembled as she tried to push herself upright, but her limbs gave out again. The townsfolk inside didn't hear her fall. Or maybe they did and chose not to come out. Either way, Kathryn lay there in the cold April rain, alone, until boots splashed near her head. "Ma'am," the voice was low, rough, and not one she recognized. She blinked up through wet lashes at the man crouched beside her. He looked like trouble, all dark stubble and wind-burned skin, his coat stitched at the shoulders and his hat pulled low. A drifter, clearly. The kind of man no one in Greystone kept around long. But he was already shrugging off his coat, wrapping it around her narrow shoulders before she could say a word. "You bleeding?" he asked. Kathryn shook her head. "Then I'm carrying you." She wanted to tell him no. She was fine. She had come all the way from Missouri for this marriage, damn it, and she would walk through hell if she had to. But her body had other ideas. Her knees buckled again the moment she tried to stand, and his arms caught her easily. She wasn't sure if she cried from the pain or the shame. He lifted her like she weighed nothing. The town was quiet as he carried her down the main street, rain ticking off his hat brim. She buried her face into his shirt, too cold to care what anyone thought. Only when he stepped onto the porch of the livery house, a building she knew was half abandoned, did she speak. "Where are you taking me?" "Somewhere dry," he said. "You need a fire and hot tea, not mud and stairs." She should have been afraid. A strange man, a quiet town, no help but him. But something in his voice, calm, even made her lean into his chest instead. Inside, the livery smelled of hay and smoke. The back room had a stove and a cot, and he laid her on it gently, kneeling beside her to tug off her ruined shoes. His coat still clung to her, warm and smelling of leather and pine. "I'm Burke Danner," he said as he lit the stove. "Came down from the Blackfoot Trail last week. Horses are my trade, mostly." Kathryn sat up slowly. Her hair clung to her cheeks and her wedding dress sagged wet against her frame. Her voice cracked. "I was supposed to marry a man named Thomas Quinn. He sent for me. I came from Franklin County. But when I stepped off the stagecoach this morning, he was gone. Left town 2 days ago. No note. Nothing." Burke's jaw tightened. She looked down at her muddy hands. "I sold everything. My parents are dead. I have no brothers. I thought." She laughed once, bitter. "I thought I was being smart." Burke crouched beside her again, his eyes steady. "You were brave. That's not the same as smart, but it's worth more." The words undid something in her. She pressed her palms to her eyes and sobbed. Real, shaking sobs that she had held in since the moment she stood alone on the platform with her satchel and no one to claim her. Burke didn't speak. He just sat beside her, close but not touching, until the fire warmed the room and her crying eased. Later, he brought her a tin mug of tea. She sipped it with both hands, silent. "What are you going to do?" he asked. She stared into the steam. "There's nowhere to go back to, no money to get there even if I wanted to." She looked up. "And the only roof I have is this one." "You can stay here," Burke said. "I'll sleep in the stable. You take the cot. No one'll bother you." "Why would you help me?" she asked, her voice quiet. He looked at her then, really looked. "Because I've been left behind before. I know how it feels." The next morning, the rain stopped. Kathryn stepped outside while Burke worked with a skittish bay mare in the paddock. He moved with quiet patience, hands steady, voice low the way he had been with her. When he saw her watching, he smiled just a little. "Feel any steadier?" he asked. "A little. You're welcome to stay as long as you need, Kathryn," she nodded. "Thank you, Burke. Really." He looked like he was about to say something else, but the mare reared, snapping the moment. Kathryn didn't ask questions. She fetched a bucket of oats, held it out, and helped calm the horse with a soft hum. Burke glanced over, surprised. "I grew up around mules," she said. "I know a bit." That night she cooked beans and cornbread over the stove. They ate together at the workbench. He told her about his years drifting Dodge City, Cheyenne, the Black Hills never staying long, never laying roots. She listened, chin in her hand, eyes soft. When he stood to clear the plates, she said, "You do not seem like a man without roots." He paused. Maybe I was waiting for the right place. Kathryn felt heat rise in her cheeks. She rose early the next morning, swept the stalls, and helped mend a torn saddle strap. Burke said nothing, but she caught the way he watched her, quiet, careful. By the end of the week, she had washed her old dress and sewn up the hem. She looked less like a ghost, more like a woman living again. One evening, after tending to a colicky foal, they sat on the porch as the sun dipped low and gold across the prairie. Her hands were rough from the work, his shirt damp from sweat. "You could leave," she said. "Ride out, find someplace better." He looked at her, long and searching. "I could," he said, "but you are still here." "I am." Her breath caught. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Then, slowly, she reached over and took his hand. He held it like it was the most precious thing in the world. By the second Sunday, Kathryn had learned the rhythm of the place well enough to anticipate the chores without being asked. She rose before first light, braided her hair back with twine, and helped water the horses before the frost burned off the grass. Burke never told her what to do, but she noticed how he moved easier with her around, less hurried, less hunched in his shoulders. That morning, while she was brushing down the gray gelding that had thrown a shoe, she glanced over and caught Burke watching the mountains. He kept one hand on the fence rail, the other loose at his side, as if waiting for something to arrive over the ridgeline. She tied off the brush and walked toward him. "You expecting someone?" she asked. He shook his head. "Just listening." "To what?" "Sometimes you hear things before you see 'em. Coyotes, riders, trouble." Kathryn stepped up beside him. "You always keep watch like that, for a long time now." She followed his gaze to the far hills. "You lose someone." Burke didn't answer right away. The wind stirred the edge of her shawl and she tucked it tighter around her arms. "My older brother," he said finally. He was the one who knew how to build fences straight and keep a herd from spooking in a storm. Fought for the Union. Took a ball through the ribs outside Petersburg. "I was 16 when I buried him." Her voice softened. "You stayed on the land after, for a while." "Our father drank what little was left. One night he tried to sell off the last mule and I hit him for it. Next morning I rode out." Kathryn's eyes didn't move from his face. "Where'd you go first?" "Arkansas, then Kansas. Took jobs where I could. Wrote my name in dirt more than on paper." She leaned her forearms on the rail, looking out across the paddock. "You ever think of stopping somewhere for good?" "I used to think I wasn't meant to." He turned to her then just slightly, and she felt the weight of his gaze settle like a hand against her back. She didn't flinch. Later that afternoon, while Burke was away bartering for feed with a rancher south of town, Kathryn took it upon herself to scrub the walls of the livery's back room. The soot-blackened boards above the stove had long since gone neglected, and the windows hadn't seen a cloth in years. She worked until her arms ached, pouring well water into a chipped basin and wringing out rags until they steamed. By the time the sun touched the edge of the cottonwoods, the room looked like it belonged to someone who meant to stay. Burke came in with dust on his boots and a canvas sack over his shoulder. He stopped in the doorway, quiet. Kathryn stood with her sleeves rolled and her hair falling out of its braid. "I didn't ask you to do all this," he said. "I know," she replied. "I wanted to." He set the sack down and peeled off his gloves. "I brought flour, figured we could make biscuits instead of cornbread." She smiled without turning. "I'd like that." That night after supper, Kathryn took a knife to a square of muslin and began stitching by lamplight. Burke leaned back in his chair across from her, his legs stretched out, watching her fingers move. "What are you making?" he asked. "Curtains. The nails are already in the frame." "You sew often." "My mother taught me before she got sick. Said a woman should know how to make something from nothing." Burke rubbed his thumb along the edge of his mug. "Sounds like she was proud of you." "She was," Kathryn said softly. She just didn't live long enough to see me become anything." Burke didn't reply, but his silence was full of something steady and respectful. She looked up, met his eyes. "I've been thinking," she said after a pause, "about taking in work. Maybe laundry or mending for the town families. You don't need to rush into anything. I'm not, but I'd rather earn my way than wait on luck." He nodded. "You can use my name for your letters if you need someone to vouch." She set her needle down. "What would you say if they asked?" Burke rested his elbows on the table. "I'd say you were the kind of woman who doesn't let the world decide what she's worth." The lamp hissed softly between them. Kathryn stood and crossed to the window, pressing her palm against the pane. Outside, the stars were beginning to show one by one. Behind her, she heard the chair scrape back. Burke came to stand beside her, not touching, but close enough she could feel his warmth through the space between them. "You're not like other men I've met," she said. "I've had time to consider who I want to be." She studied his reflection in the glass. "And who is that?" He turned to face her fully. "Someone you can trust." Her breath caught, but she didn't look away. "You've already done more for me than anyone has in years." "I'd do it again," he said. Her hand slid down the glass and came to rest at her side. She didn't speak, but she didn't step back either. He reached for her hand slowly, giving her time to move, to say no. She didn't. Fingers laced, they stood there in the hush of the room, the world outside turning dark and still, as if it too had paused to breathe. The frost lifted slowly that next week, giving way to earth soft enough for planting. Burke brought in 2 sacks of seed potatoes from a trader up near Deer Lodge, and Kathryn cleared a patch of ground behind the livery with a flat spade, and her sleeves rolled to the elbows. She didn't wait to be asked. She needed the work as much as the harvest it might one day bring. Burke joined her after the midday chores, his shirt damp at the collar and the skin at his throat gone brown from sun. He carried a wooden-handled hoe and a length of twine for marking rows. "You've got the start of something here," he said, eyeing the plot. Kathryn pushed her hair back with her wrist. "It's southern soil I'm used to. This ground's different, but I figure a thing doesn't grow unless you try." He knelt and sank the twine stakes. "You've got the hands for it. That's the hard part." She crouched beside him, pressing a seed into the dirt. "I didn't expect to be planting anything this spring. Not like this." Sometimes a season don't ask what you expected. They worked without speaking for a while, the only sound the scrape of tools and the low call of birds near the cottonwoods. When the last row was in, Burke stood and brushed the dirt from his palms. "You ever think about having land of your own?" he asked. Kathryn sat back on her heels. "I used to, before things shifted." He nodded once, then stepped away to fetch the water bucket. She watched his back move beneath the faded cloth of his shirt, the way he didn't fill silence just to fill it. That evening, after the tools were stowed, she found him in the stall with the mare he'd been breaking to saddle. He was rubbing her flank with a burlap cloth, voice low and even. Kathryn leaned on the half door and waited until he noticed her. "Did you ever ride the cattle trails?" she asked. He looked up. "Kishome, once, long drive from Texas north, dust so thick you coughed blood by dusk. Why'd you stop?" "Too many nights with a rope for a pillow. Too many men who'd shoot you for a spilled cup." She stepped into the stall and ran her hand along the mare's neck. "You didn't strike me as someone who stayed away from rough work. Hard work's fine. But I got tired of waking up not knowing who'd still be breathing." The mare shifted her weight, ears flicking. Kathryn kept her hand steady. "I think I would have liked to have seen Texas," she said. Burke leaned against the post. "You still can." She shook her head. "I don't want to leave, not now, not when I'm learning what steady feels like." The horse nickered and pressed her nose against Kathryn's shoulder. She laughed, quiet and surprised. "You've got a good touch," Burke said. "I never knew I did." "Not until now." The lamp in the tack room threw soft light across the floorboards as they left the stall. Kathryn paused at the doorway. "I never thanked you, not properly." Burke's brow creased. "You don't owe me that. I mean it." She turned to face him. "You didn't have to take me in. Plenty of men would have walked on by. I saw a woman who deserved better, that's all." She stepped close enough to feel the warmth of him. You make it sound simple, it was, still is. Kathryn reached up, fingers brushing the edge of his jaw. He didn't move, just let her touch him like she had every right to. I don't know what comes next, she said. Burke's voice was low. I'm not going anywhere, that's what I know. Her hand slid down, resting against his chest. I want to try, she whispered. I want to see what this can be. His arms came around her carefully, like he was afraid she might vanish again. But she didn't. She stayed right there, steady in his arms, as the wind moved through the cracks in the boards and the world outside turned quiet for them alone. Kathryn pulled back the curtain she'd sewn and hooked it to one side, letting the morning light spill into the room. A dry breeze carried the scent of dust and pine through the open window, and for a long moment she stood still, letting it settle on her skin. Her reflection in the windowpane looked clearer now, less like the girl who'd arrived in rain-soaked lace, more like a woman who'd been working the land with her own hands. She turned at the sound of footsteps on the porch. Burke stepped inside with a folded note in his hand and a thin crease between his brows. Miller from the feed store rode out early, he said, holding out the note. Said a man left this with him 2 nights back. Kathryn took it, her fingers steady. The paper was folded twice, the ink rushed and uneven. She read it once, then again, slower. Her lips pressed into a line. It's from Thomas Quinn, she said. He says he got turned around and that Greystone was never what he pictured. Burke leaned against the doorframe. He asked you to follow him? No, he said he hopes I found some other path. She refolded the note. Didn't even sign his name. Burke didn't speak, but his jaw set hard. Kathryn laid the note on the table and smoothed the edge with her thumb. I should have known when he stopped writing come winter. I didn't want to admit I'd been left behind again. You weren't, Burke said. She met his eyes. No, she said softly. I wasn't. They stood in silence for a beat, the kind that felt more like a decision than a pause. I've been thinking about building a second stall, Burke said. There's a merchant family passing through next month with 2 geldings. Might be worth making room. She pulled the curtain fully open. I could paint the door. The wood's dry enough now. He crossed the room, picking up a bent nail from the table. I'll need to saw new beams for the frame. There's still pine stacked behind the fence. Kathryn looked at him, the corner of her mouth lifting. You're not asking if I'm staying. I'm not. Later that morning, they hauled the timber around the side of the stable. Kathryn rolled up her sleeves without a word and steadied the sawhorse while Burke worked the blade. His rhythm was careful but firm, and when she passed him a fresh wedge of wood, he caught her fingers with his for a moment longer than needed. You ever fix a roof? He asked, once the beams were stacked. Not alone, she said, but I watched my uncle rethatch ours when I was 12. He dropped the hammer more than he used it. Burke's laugh was quiet. That's about what I expect of mine. She brushed sawdust from her skirt. If we're patching shingles, we'll need pitch, the barrel behind the smithy's half full. He echoed. She looked at him then, not as a guest or someone passing through, but as a woman standing alongside the man who'd carried her out of the rain. Yes, she said. That afternoon, they worked side by side. Kathryn climbed the ladder barefoot, nails tucked into a tin at her waist. Burke handed her the hammer without a word and steadied the ladder as she took the first swing. When dusk came, they sat beneath the eaves, the sky streaked with late light, and the scent of pine pitch thick on their clothes. Burke's hand found hers as they leaned back against the wall. You ever wonder what your life might have been if he'd stayed? She shook her head. I don't need to wonder. He didn't. Burke turned to her. And now, she met his gaze, steady, now I know what it means when someone stays. He didn't kiss her then, he didn't need to. Instead, he brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear and said, Tomorrow, I'll take you to the West Ridge. There's a field that blooms early. I think you'd like it. Kathryn rested her head against his shoulder, her voice low. I'd like to see where we're going. His hand tightened around hers. So would I, he said. The trail to the West Ridge curled behind the livery, winding through a shallow rise of pine and quaking aspen where the horses liked to graze when left to wander. Kathryn walked beside Burke with a wool shawl tucked around her shoulders, the morning sun warm at her back. He carried a basket looped over one arm, the handle worn smooth from long use. "You always pack like we're going out for a week?" she asked, glancing at the weight of it. Burke looked ahead, his eyes on the break in the trees. "I figured if we were going to do this proper, we ought to do it right." They crested the ridge just after midday. The grass had grown taller since the last snow melted, and patches of wild lupine stretched in soft blue across the rise, swaying in the light wind. Kathryn stepped into the field and let her shawl fall to her elbows. "It's quiet up here." Burke unrolled a blanket beside a crooked cedar and laid the basket down. "There's a spring just a little farther west, coldest water I ever tasted." She turned to him, brushing a hand through the tall grass. "You've been bringing people up here?" "No," he said, meeting her eyes. "Only you." They ate bread he'd bought from the widow Sultan and cheese wrapped in wax paper. Kathryn poured water into 2 tin cups and passed him one without speaking. The quiet between them wasn't heavy. It had become something they shared as easily as work. Afterward, she lay back with her eyes closed, the sun against her face. Burke rested on one elbow beside her, watching the way her chest moved with each breath. "I've been thinking about building out the back of the livery," he said. "Making a second room, not just for storage." Kathryn opened her eyes. "For what then?" "For us," he said. She sat up slowly. "You're sure?" "I've never been more." Kathryn studied him, her hands folded in her lap. "I don't have much. Not the kind of dowry women are supposed to bring. I'm not looking for one." She reached out and touched his arm. "I want to share what we have, not just sleep under the same roof. I want to make something that lasts." Burke leaned in, close enough that the brim of his hat brushed hers. "Then we'll build it piece by piece, you and me." They didn't kiss yet. They just sat there, breathing together, the wind stirring the grass around them. By the time they made it back to town, the sun had dipped behind the hills, and the lamplighters were making their way along the main road with matches in hand. Burke turned the horses out to pasture, and Kathryn lit the stove with practiced ease. That evening, she took a folded length of muslin from the shelf and laid it across the table. The edges were hemmed in even stitches, and the corners had been embroidered with a single pine needle in green thread. "I was saving this for when I left," she said. "But I think it belongs here now." Burke ran his fingers along the cloth. "It's the first thing that's made this table look like a home." She set a pot of stew down, steam curling into the air, and sat across from him. He filled her bowl first, without asking. "I stopped in at the blacksmith's on my way back from the ridge," he said. "Asked if he'd marry us come Sunday." Kathryn stilled, her spoon halfway to her lips. "What did he say?" He said yes, that he'd be honored. She didn't speak for a moment. Then she set her spoon down gently and reached across the table for his hand. "I don't need lace or ribbons," she said. "Just you, just this." Burke turned her hand over and pressed his lips to her knuckles. "That's all I've got. And it's all I need." They married under the cottonwoods 2 days later, with the blacksmith's wife humming a hymn while she held the book. Kathryn wore a blue dress she'd let down at the hem, and Burke had scrubbed the dust from his boots and combed his hair flat with water. The town gathered on quiet feet, some bringing flowers, others offering jars of jam or sacks of flour. No one mentioned how she'd arrived. No one needed to. After the vows, Burke wrapped his coat around her shoulders and kissed her once, slow and sure. That night, they lay side by side on the cot they'd widened with planks and wool batting, the window open to the sound of frogs in the creek. Kathryn rested her cheek against his chest and his arm curled around her back. "I want to plant beans next spring," she whispered. "Maybe onions, too. We'll do it together. I think I'd like to teach the Sultan girls how to sew. They'll learn better from you than from anyone." She smiled into the hollow of his shoulder. "You're not just saying that because you married me." "I said it because it's true," he replied. Outside, the wind moved gently through the leaves. Inside, the warmth between them held, the months that followed unfolded with quiet purpose. Kathryn took in mending from the town ladies and taught two of the Salton girls how to thread a needle steady. Burke built the second room, just wide enough for a proper bed and a shelf of books the general store had nearly forgotten they carried. In May, they added a second paddock. By June, they had a milk cow that Kathryn named Fern. Come July, the potatoes she'd planted greened into thick vines, and Burke built a fence around the garden to keep the deer from nosing in. On warm evenings, they sat on the porch and watched the light stretch long across the prairie. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. It didn't matter. They had chosen each other, steady and without ceremony, and in the choosing they had made a life that held nothing sudden, nothing grand. Just a love stitched quiet as curtains, strong as fence posts, and as lasting as the land beneath their feet.